I'm Bob Darwin. I presently live in Asheboro, North Carolina, but I grew up here in Gastonia, spent my childhood here and my teen years and so forth. And I'm the son of Jack Darwin, who worked in various managerial positions here at Firestone Textiles. I'm now retired after 41 years as a general dentist, most of which were in Asheboro, North Carolina. My dad began his employment here at Firestone in Gastonia in November of 1943. That was at the height of World War II, and he retired July the 1st of 1976. He worked entirely in the administrative office capacities. He was part of the management team, and he actually, a point of interest, began his association with Firestone Tire and Rubber Company back in 1933 in his hometown of Gaffney, South Carolina. My dad had graduated from Duke University in 1933. This was the height of the Great Depression, as everyone knows, and jobs were extremely difficult to come by. So Dad went back to his hometown in Gaffney, and the only job that he could come up with was helping to manage a service station there in Gaffney. So he literally began his career with Firestone and Firestone tires from the ground up. He repaired flat tires, he fixed tires, and he sold Firestone tires because that service station happened to be an authorized Firestone dealer at the time. Dad was recruited actually from Akers Motor Lines here in Gastonia by Firestone to come work for them in their accounting department. After Dad worked at the service station in Gaffney, he became a school teacher for a year or two in McCall, South Carolina. He taught high school chemistry and math. He had a strong suit in the area of math and science. And then after that, he took a job as an accountant with Marlboro Cotton Mills in Bennettsville, South Carolina, which was very close to McCall. Ironically, that particular mill would later be purchased by Firestone Textiles and would ultimately become a plant that he helped to supervise and manage. But he worked there at Marlboro Cotton Mills for several years, and in 1939, he married my mom, the former Mary Alice McElween of Lancaster, South Carolina. And he had been offered a job in Gastonia with Akers Motor Lines. Akers Motor Lines at that time was a rapidly expanding business, and they were in search of someone to help with their accounts receivable. So Dad accepted that job, and he and my mom moved to Gastonia, began to put down roots here in the community. And I would say that one point I would definitely like to make is that with the old saying about behind every good, successful man, there's a wonderful lady, and that was certainly the case with my mom and Dad. But they began their life here in Gastonia. My mom later became a full-time homemaker and raised two sons, and my dad proceeded with his career. But she was always extremely supportive of my dad in his career and his efforts. So in 1943, my dad received a phone call, apparently, from someone associated with Firestone here, and they offered him a job in the accounting department, and as he would say later, it was one of those job offers that I simply couldn't refuse. So in 1943, he made the decision to leave Akers Motor Lines, and by the way, fully with Mr. John Akers' blessing at the time. I think my dad had done an excellent job there, but he made the move to the accounting department here at Firestone. I think as far as why was he selected to be contacted by Firestone, I would simply just have to say he was a very talented, smart young gentleman at the time, and I think he would have been a very excellent candidate for any similar position that was available. My dad was an extremely hard worker. He had a strong work ethic. He was very personable. He was sort of the classical Southern gentleman of the day, very polite, kind, fair, He expected a lot of the people who were around him. He valued very much doing a good job and doing the job right the first time. So I feel fairly certain that he had established a very commendable reputation and record in his previous jobs, and therefore that probably led Firestone to him. Yes, Dad joined the accounting department at Firestone. And from there, his career progressed through a number of positions, with Firestone Textiles. He was here almost 33 years total in his career. He was very loyal and very dedicated to Firestone, and Firestone valued that very much. I think a lot of corporations valued loyalty and dedication back in that era. But he began in the accounting department. Shortly after he began his career here, he was promoted to the chief accountant for the plant and stayed in that position several years, certainly until the end of the war. And the plant was very involved with the war effort at that time, of course, with the importance of rubber products and tires for the military. In the 1950s, he became the sales manager for their cotton yarn division, and he held that position for probably most of the 1950s. So he was actively involved in sales. He did do some traveling at that time, not a lot as you would typically expect of sales today, but I do recall trips to New York City and Providence, Rhode Island, and occasionally to Akron, Ohio, where the Firestone main office, Tire and Rubber Company main office was. It was always an exciting time to go to the Charlotte airport back in its infancy and pick my dad up after he returned from one of those trips. And this was back in the days when you actually walked out on the tarmac to greet people as they got off of the airplane. So I have some fairly vivid memories of that. In 1960, Mr. Harold Mercer came to the plant here as the plant manager, and my dad moved into a position as his administrative assistant. And Mr. Mercer had worked with Firestone in Akron, Ohio. Dad remained in that position until 1966, and in 1966 there began a series of corporate restructurings and realignments out of Akron. And at that time, the decision was made to actually move the Firestone Textile division to be based and headquartered in Gastonia, here at the Gastonia plant. It had previously been based in Akron, Ohio. So Mr. Mercer at that point was made president of the textiles division of Firestone, and my dad was made the general manager of the Firestone Textiles division. And at that point, he was given responsibility for 5 textile plants that were part of Firestone Textiles, with supervision over approximately 3,000 employees. And one of those plants that he managed, as I mentioned earlier, turned out to be the former Marlboro Cotton Mills in Bennettsville, South Carolina, where he had many years before that become an accountant for them, long before he knew that he would end up at Firestone in Gastonia. In 1968, Mr. Harold Mercer retired. There were more realignments and restructuring from the corporate standpoint. The headquarters for a brief time was moved from Gastonia, then within a year it was moved back to Gastonia, and Mr. Jim Call was sent from Akron to become the new president of the textiles division. And at that time, my dad became the administrative assistant to Mr. Call. He remained as plant manager of the Gastonia plant for a while during all these transitions, and then his final position with Firestone before his retirement was as administrative assistant to Mr. Jim Call. That predates me just a little bit, but my recollection is that at that point in the 40s, they were still involved with a lot of cotton production, It was prior to the era of as many of the synthetic fibers as we have now. But they were very much involved in creating the tire cord that went into Firestone tires. And as such, it was such a critical element to the war effort, because all of the military equipment, of course, had to have tires. And you could not buy. I've heard stories of the ration coupons that people had during the war years. You could not buy tires just on a random basis, maybe every several years if you had a coupon. And the same was true of gasoline and a number of other items like that. And eventually the plant transitioned into synthetic fibers, rayon, nylon particularly, and then polyester some in the later years, that became the underlying fiber in the tire cord that went into manufacture of the tires. I worked here for a couple of summers when I was in college and just before I began college. Firestone had a very excellent program at the time in which they committed to hiring children of employees, not just children of management, but children of employees throughout the plant to work during the summer. And that was a very valuable experience in many, many ways to me. It later on helped me a great deal with educational expenses. I worked here in the summer of 1966, just before I left to go to Duke University to begin my undergraduate studies. And at that time I worked in the machine shop, which was down on the very lower level of the plant, and I was classified as a bench mechanic at the time. Basically my job consisted of running a drill press, and it was very repetitive and so forth, but we manufactured and repaired various metal components of all of the machinery and the equipment that was here in the plant at the time. And it was quite a good experience for me. It broadened my horizons in a lot of ways. It opened my eyes to a lot of things. I would say that in my second employment here was a couple of years later in 1968. And during that experience, I was actually a laboratory technician in the new chemical laboratory that had been set up to enforce quality control on products that were going through the plant treatment unit. At the time, I was majoring in chemistry in college, so again, it was a tremendous experience for me to get to put into practice some of the things I was actually learning in school. We laughed a little bit earlier about was there an explosion the first day I was there. No, there wasn't, because I would have to emphasize to you how extremely important safety was in this plant. Not only that year, knowing that I was going to arrive on the scene, but throughout my dad's entire career. The lab was, at the time, it was state-of-the-art. We performed a lot of typical chemical laboratory analyses that involved a lot of hot water and centrifuges and various chemicals to analyze the treatments that were being done on the fabric produced here to be sure that the quality was up to snuff. But Firestone had supported the concept of the safety first logo for years and years and years, and if I'm not mistaken, there used to be a large signboard out in front of the plant that would keep track of their no lost time accidents on the job. They were very proud of their record, and quality control also was an extremely key thing that was emphasized. And so what I was doing in the lab, which was a very small operation, there was a new chemist who had been hired not too long before that, who was actually in charge of having set up the lab, and so I worked with him, and there were one or two other students who during the summer worked there also, and I think after we left in the summer, he eventually had a full-time assistant in there. So the conditions there were quite a bit different than what I had experienced in the machine shop, which I'll talk about the differences between those in a few minutes, hopefully. My last experience actually with Firestone came in the summer of 1969, but it was with the Firestone synthetic fibers plant in Hopewell, Virginia. And I was a laboratory assistant, again, there in their chemical lab.
You mentioned safety.
Occasionally I would be out in the mill, but primarily I remained in the areas where I was assigned, which was the machine shop and the chemistry lab, as I mentioned. We did have a lot of safety precautions that we took in both of those areas. Things like eye shields, eyeglasses, protective footwear, steel-toed boots, things like that in the machine shop particularly. And of course in the chemical lab we had all of the protective garb depending on what we were doing, whether it was protective glasses or laboratory coats or protective lab jackets, things of that nature.
What was the function of the machine shop? You mentioned that.
Yeah. The machine shop was responsible for a lot of the maintenance throughout the plant, and we did do some manufacturing of new components. It may be nuts and bolts or a particular angle iron or something like that. As I recall, it all dealt with metal. And then repair of the existing equipment. And of course there was a tremendous amount of equipment in this plant. The twisting machines, the looms, all that was involved in operating those. There were a tremendous number of mechanical parts, and with time they would wear out, of course, and had to be replaced and or repaired. And so the machine shop sort of had first line of duty over that, and then they were called upon just for routine maintenance types of things that might come up at times too. And then my older brother also worked here at the plant, David, and he worked here probably a couple of summers on the maintenance crew. And he worked out in the floors of the plant more than I had that type of contact, but I remember a lot of stories from him about being very high up on ladders, sort of bent back over double, painting the really high ceilings throughout this plant, which I can see they've restored. And on a recent visit of his, he immediately noticed that they've removed all the paint that he spent a whole lot of sweat and grime working to put on there. And then the plant at that time, of course, was not air conditioned. That was pretty much unheard of textile plants in that era. And there were huge exhaust fans that were in many of the windows, and those had to be cleaned periodically. Actually, the Firestone News, which was a monthly newsletter published by Firestone and given to all employees. I guess you would say it was the social media of the day. That was the way people kept up with each other's families. with what was going on in their lives, particular recognitions, achievements. There were some bits of business news in there too, because of course everyone was always anxious to know about the business and how things were going business-wise, but it was mainly something that brought families together, and everyone felt that they were part of something special. I think there was a certain degree of pride in knowing that you were a member, or whether it was an employee or a child of an employee of the Firestone community, because Firestone was a very large operation. It was extremely important to Gastonia. It had provided for a lot of families, and it was very well respected within the community. So community is truly the outstanding word to describe Firestone. In regards to the working conditions here at the plant back in the 1960s, I can certainly say first and foremost in the summers when I was here, it was hot. It was very hot, and word was that up on the 5th floor, particularly on some summer afternoons, the temperature would get above 120 degrees, for example. So it was hot, it was dirty, it was greasy, it was oily. There was a lot of lint in the air, dust in the air, the smell of new fabric, and most notably noise. The mill was a real bustling center of activity always. The machines made quite a bit of noise when they were in operation. In fact, for a good distance outside of the plant, you could hear the hum or the roar of the machinery in full operation. So when you were actually on the floor, you needed ear protection to be really safe in that regard, and that's something that did come down the pike. I doubt that it was here in the 1940s. I don't know for sure, but as part of their safety efforts, that was incorporated later on. So there was constant noise. Another very interesting thing is the vibration that existed on the floors in the production facilities, because there were wooden floors. The machinery, of course, was very heavy, and it was very active machinery. When the looms were working and they were shooting shuttles back and forth from one side to the other, there was the constant clack, clack, clack of the shuttles, and the hum of the twister machines and so forth. So it created a lot of vibration of the floors, and I was not there enough myself to personally really experience that, but I've been told that the workers, in many cases in the textile mills at that time, developed a certain gait in their walk, which was an effort to compensate for the vibration of the floor. I guess you might describe it as being somewhat similar to walking the aisle of a moving train that's rocking back and forth a little bit. So they developed a certain gait or a certain walk. And I was told that, out in the community that, people could look at someone and identify their gait and know that that was someone who worked in one of the textile mills. So that was very interesting.
Dad was in the outer office.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. My dad worked in the administrative office. It was a neat, clean facility. It was not elaborate in any way. It was composed of a number of different actually individual offices. I don't remember a lot of office cubicles, as we would tend to say today. Individual offices. They were furnished at the time with what I would say was the classical battleship gray metal desk and file cabinet and chair type of seating. But as I say, it was always very well maintained. When you entered the office, in the very small reception area, there was a classic switchboard operator who was sitting there, and she would operate the switchboard and pull the cords in and out as she was connecting various telephone lines. That was always fascinating to me as a child. And then she would greet visitors. The office always smelled of cigarette smoke during that era. It was not a time where smoking was banned in office buildings or production facilities, and many of the people who worked in there did smoke. One of their possessions, I would say, that most had on their desk was a little miniature Firestone tire that was a replica of what the current Firestone tire design was, and in the center of the tire there was a glass ashtray. And most people had those on their desk for their use. But the people there were always extremely nice, extremely kind. It was a great management team. There was really only one office in that building, and like I say, it was not a plush or elaborate office at the time by any means, certainly not by today's standards. But the one office there that I recall that sort of stood out from the others, as you might expect, was Mr. Mercer's office, who was the plant manager and then the president of the division. And his office was nicely paneled, very tastefully. And behind his desk, there was a huge mounted sailfish that he had caught on one of his fishing ventures. Again, as a child, I was always extremely fascinated to see that. But I was always very proud to go in that office building and get to go see my dad at his office. One of the very earliest memories that I have, and this would have been age 3 or 4 maybe, or less, was that we only had one car at the time in the family, and so Dad would be driven to work and then picked up at the end of the day. So Mom would load my brother and me into our car at about 4:30 or so, and we would go and park over by the railroad track a short distance from here and wait for the train to come by. It was probably the Crescent, I'm not sure, but it would come by right on schedule every day, and the engineer would always wave at us and blow the whistle for us. And when that train had passed, we knew that it was time to drive on over and park in front of the office building and pick up my dad. Now, Firestone was extremely good as a corporate citizen in the way that it treated its entire family and its employees. Most of the activities that I recall always involved fun. They were family oriented, and they were generally centered around recreation of some type or recognitions of some type. For all of the children of employees, absolutely one of the highlights every year was the annual Christmas party, which the plant sponsored at the old Webb Theater downtown. And all employees' children were invited to go on a Saturday morning. There was a movie shown and then several cartoons, and then Santa Claus would appear, AKA, I think, Mr. Ralph Johnson, who was the recreation director here at Firestone at the time. And Santa would present each child with a wrapped Christmas package. And it was a real thrill and a real treat. Of course, Firestone always displayed the lights on the tower out here and the stars around the side of the tower and the Christmas season. And to Gastonia, that always tended to herald the beginning of the Christmas season. And you knew when the Firestone lights went on that Christmas couldn't be far behind. So we always look forward to driving out and seeing the lights when they had been turned on. But Firestone sponsored many, many programs for its employees, all of its employees, not just management. There was a bowling league, little league, softball. Of course, across the street here, there was a very nice park with a swimming pool, swing sets, and so forth that all the children enjoyed during the summer. There were Friday night bingo games that were held at the recreation center. I remember quite well as a family going to that together and playing bingo, and if you won, you might have gotten a candy bar or soft drink or something of that nature as a prize, but it was something that we all looked forward to. I think there was even a duck pin bowling alley in the old recreation center. I'm not 100% sure of that. And as I said, there was the bowling league that they sponsored. But they sponsored a lot of events that were centered around recognition for various things that either employees or employees' children had been involved with or achieved. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company itself sponsored the Firestone Scholarship, which was a nationwide kind of competition, and that was open to employees' children. And the Gastonia plant over the years was very fortunate to have several winners of the Firestone Scholarship, and that the plant encouraged educational opportunities. It encouraged employees to seek additional educational opportunities for their children, and the Firestone Scholarship really helped to facilitate that for many, many people, as well as the summer job opportunities that I mentioned earlier. So there were always award and recognition ceremonies for that. Firestone very much valued loyalty and dedication to the people who worked and served here. They were presented with various length of service pins after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of employment and so forth. And these became very valued items for many, many families. Firestone routinely sponsored blood mobiles, for example. So they were very, very active in the community and did a great, great deal for their employees. A very clear answer to that, values. Of course, my parents worked hard to instill certain values in their children, but all of that was very strongly reinforced by the association with Firestone and the Firestone community here. As I mentioned, there were many, many people who were very hard workers here. The work here was hard, it was repetitive, it was physically difficult on the production lines, but there was a real strong work ethic. And I think that helped to develop my own work ethic. I learned a lot about loyalty and dedication, a lot about integrity, the importance of honesty in all aspects of your life, not only at work, but outside of the work scene. I developed a sense of the importance actually of friendships and camaraderie on the job, because I noticed how important that was to the people who worked here. Some of my parents' closest friends over the years were fellow Firestone employees, and there were friendships that lasted their entire lives. So all these things came to bear. The perception that I gained just in the operation of such a large organization was very helpful too, to see that organization was extremely important in a business. The emphasis on safety, the emphasis on quality control that Firestone had at the time. I know my dad was very big on, if a job is worth doing, it's worth doing right, and it's worth doing right the first time. And I think that certainly carried over to me, and it carried from him into the operation of the plant here. But all of these things I think were very important to me later in life, and especially as I ultimately became the owner and manager of my own dental practice, because I faced on a very small scale, a lot of the same issues that were involved in operating a plant of this size. One other thing that I gained a great appreciation for was the importance of manufacturing, not only in Gastonia, but in the country at large. Of course, manufacturing has taken a pretty big hit in this country over the last 2 or 3 decades, but I realize that there are many, many people out there that gain a great deal of satisfaction and take a lot of pride in being able to contribute to actually making something and making a product, and that's where manufacturing comes in. And so the more we can revitalize various types of manufacturing here, I think the better, because it will help fulfill this inner need for a lot of people in terms of employment. But Firestone was a very, very stable operation. It provided a lot of security to its employees and its families over the years, and it has helped me tremendously to have had that background. Absolutely. The first thing when I walked in here after the renovations was nostalgia. There were just a ton of memories that flooded forth. And then the second thing was absolute amazement. at what has been done. I think the facility is absolutely beautiful, and the fact that they've been able to repurpose this great facility is wonderful. And so I particularly am so pleased that Rick Kessel and Preservation North Carolina became involved to help establish the Kessel History Center here. And without that, and with the work of Amanda Edwards, I probably wouldn't be here today to be able to share my own memories, but I think it's a very rich heritage that needs to be preserved. And but I do hope that the redevelopment of the Firestone mill here can serve as an economic engine for West Gastonia, as it used to be, to help revitalize the entire area. And Firestone overall was just a fantastic corporate citizen for Gastonia. They provided well for their employees. They had an outstanding group of workers in the workforce and the management team, and they contributed, many employees here contributed countless hours of dedicated service outside of the plant for good causes in the community, and a lot of leadership within the community. I do know that in my dad's case, I certainly recall the many hours that he spent evenings and otherwise engaged in other community activities and leadership positions throughout the community. Kiwanis was particularly dear to him, for example. And if Firestone hadn't been here, a lot of that leadership and energy might not have been available. So Firestone was an outstanding corporate citizen. One other interesting little poignant fact that I would like to share is that this was probably in the mid-60s, but my dad was here, of course, in management, and there was a team that came to the plant from Japan, engineers and so forth, who wanted to look over the operation here. And the local folks were very willing and very open to that. And so they did come, and they were just here intensely inspecting everything about the operation, everything about the plant, asking many questions, according to my dad, and just looking at every minute detail. And my dad was so impressed with that I recall he came home that evening after helping to show the people through the plant and explain operations. And he said, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if someday the Japanese don't own the company. And sure enough, down the road, Bridgestone Tire and Rubber bought Firestone. I did not grow up actually on the Mill Village, but not too far from the Mill Village over in the Yorkchester neighborhood here in Gastonia. Our home was of a fairly modest nature, and there was my dad and mom and my brother and me, but we had a very good childhood, a very warm, loving relationship was a part of that home, and I have many fond memories of that home. It was a fantastic neighborhood, I think, very much as folks who lived here in the village near the plant. In those days, there were a lot of children. We were all part of the baby boom generation, and we kids tended to roam in packs during the day. During the summer, particularly all day at times, and during school time, as soon as we got home from school, there would just be a large group of kids in the neighborhood that would meet at one person's house one day and another person's house the next day, and we had a wonderful time. It was a very good time to be a child here, and while our circumstances physically may have appeared to be a little better than others, I think the amount of love that was shown there was epitomized the same amount of love that was shown right here on the Mill Village. Quite frankly, I don't know a whole lot of details about it, other than I was aware that it took place, and I was not aware of any real incidents or a lot of difficulties with that process. I think at that time, Gastonia was a fairly forward-looking community. Integration did take place in the plant in the 1960s. I'm not aware of a lot of difficulties that occurred at that time. I was aware that the plant had been integrated and the various facilities and the programs of the plant were integrated, but I was not aware that there were any major incidents associated with that. I think Gastonia at the time was a fairly forward-looking community. It had had good race relations for a fairly long period of time, if I'm not mistaken. Even at that time, it had representation on the city council, maybe even the school boards. But as far as I know, I frankly don't know a lot of real details about that, other than my impression would be that it must not have been too strenuous or difficult to process, because I really did not hear much of anything about it, and I would have expected that out of the Firestone community, just from the sense of camaraderie and so forth that I had experienced in the time that I had worked here, and just the general attitude of respect that existed within the community, each one for the other.